Revenge on ex-wife. I first encountered my husband's ex-wife nearly 3 decades ago, right around the time I met him. Though of course I'd heard stories long before I actually saw her face. In retrospect, so much time has passed that it feels almost surreal to think back on how everything started, and how slowly it all escalated into one of the most emotionally draining experiences I've ever had. If someone had told me way back then that I'd spend the next 10 or more years fending off petty jabs, manipulation, and outright hostility, I might have been less polite about letting her into my life. But often, we don't get that choice, especially when children are involved and when divorce finances create a never-ending tangle. Let me begin with the bare outlines of what happened, then I'll unspool the rest so it all makes sense. My husband, John, married his first wife, who I'll call Jane, roughly 30 years ago from this moment in time. The marriage deteriorated long before I met him, but let's just say it hadn't exactly ended on friendly terms. At the time, they were still going through the financial aspects of a separation, plus living in a complicated arrangement that gave Jane far more power than she should have had. Even after they were no longer living as a couple, they technically shared ownership of the marital home, meaning John had a sort of office in that house, while Jane stayed there all day, despite the emotional distance between them. The trouble was that Jane felt entitled to all of his domestic help, even though they weren't functionally together. She wanted him to do things like washing, ironing, cleaning, duties that presumably had been part of their married life. Yet now they were separated, and she still insisted he fulfill them, seemingly because the deed had both of their names on it. Jane had an entrepreneurial streak, though not a successful one. She launched little businesses, but each one folded. She'd then try another venture, ignoring her failures, investing more money she didn't really have, only to watch it collapse. At last, she decided to open a clothes shop and fixated on this as the solution to all her financial woes. This shop became her obsession. Meanwhile, John was renting a small house in the next village because the tension in the matrimonial home was unbearable. He still had to maintain his own business, which at that point was floundering due to a bad debt that left him in dire straits. Money was tight, but Jane cared only about her new project. She insisted he do the entire fit-out for her shop, which included crafting a beautiful wooden counter that became the centerpiece. He poured hours of labor into that counter, building it by hand, spending money on materials he really couldn't spare, simply to appease her. Once it was done, she praised its beauty, but that praise didn't stop her from ignoring the reality that John was living on the edge financially. When I first met John, I wasn't privy to the entire backstory. I knew he was separated but not yet divorced. I also learned he had 2 children, a boy and a girl, whom he adored. I was younger than him by a fair margin, and I just divorced my own husband, so it was like we were 2 people coming out of separate tragedies, crossing paths in the midst of sorting out our own respective chaos. Physically, I'm short and somewhat heavy-set, which isn't necessarily relevant except that Jane, as I would discover, was quite rude about it. I guess she saw me as competition or a threat, so she seized on any angle she could use to belittle me. John's children were, to put it diplomatically, a handful. They lacked discipline in their mother's home. Jane wasn't the type to enforce structure or consistent rules. Perhaps she was too focused on her businesses to pay close attention. So these kids, whenever they came to see John, were used to minimal boundaries and ran rather wild. But I tried to be understanding. They were caught in the crossfire of a messy separation. I had my own place, a small flat I'd gotten post-divorce, but John lived 100 miles away from me, renting a house near his kids so he could see them regularly. He juggled a failing business and tried to keep up child support. Jane had her own demands. If the kids needed to be picked up or dropped off, she believed that was exclusively John's job. Never mind that he lived in precarious conditions. If he couldn't do it, she'd hire someone else and then demand he pay their fee anyway. Not long after, John's business collapsed entirely. He lost his rented house because he couldn't afford it. That's when he moved in with his own mother, an older woman living somewhere in the middle between his area and mine. Jane was furious because she lost her free chauffeur and babysitter. She'd called John to vent that he needed to come back and pick the kids up from school, or run them to some event, ignoring the fact that he was a couple of hours away. When that didn't work, she found someone else to do it for her, and then she'd angrily inform John that he owed her money for it. It was madness. The tension between them was constant, and I'd watch John's stress levels spike anytime his phone buzzed with a call from her. At one point, he managed to secure an overseas job for 3 months. Before he left, I finally met Jane in person. Of course, I had heard all kinds of stories about her, so I was prepared for hostility. She didn't disappoint. Right in front of me, she'd call me that short fat thing, as if I weren't standing there listening. I had a temper, but I also recognized that if I lashed out, it would just confirm any negative narrative she was peddling to the kids, so I held my tongue. John, who also hated confrontation, wanted to keep the peace for his children's sake. He finished that overseas contract, and then eventually moved in with me, even though we had to juggle his weekend visits with the kids. On some weekends, we'd drive the 100 miles or more to see them. On others, we'd bring them to my place. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was what we could afford to do. Eventually, the official divorce between John and Jane proceeded. She made it as complicated as possible. Jane believed John owed her a certain lifestyle, that he should pay for her gardener, her house cleaner, her ironing lady, her general handyman, plus cover her credit card bills. She justified all this by claiming he'd only married her initially because she was pregnant, so now she deserved compensation for having been an unwanted wife. But the solicitor she hired apparently told her that such demands would look ridiculous in court. She went ballistic, but the legal system required her to dial back the absurd requests, or risk having a judge see her as exploitative. Meanwhile, John tried to keep calm, focusing on doing what was legally required, paying child support, and sorting out finances fairly. Jane also pulled manipulative tricks with the kids. She rarely let John know about their school events or extracurricular activities. He'd find out about important ceremonies or parent-teacher meetings only after the fact, so he'd miss them. And then she'd tell the children, "See, your dad doesn't care." He had to start directly contacting the school's clubs or organizations just to learn their schedules, as Jane never passed on the information. She'd also blackmail the kids emotionally, saying things like, "I'll tell your dad you did that," hinting that John would fly off the handle. In reality, John was a pretty gentle father, but she portrayed him as harsh to maintain control. I remember a point in my own life where I became quite ill and dropped a good amount of weight due to health issues. We saw less of Jane, but whenever we did, she'd comment on my appearance in some backhanded way. Still, we tried to keep face-to-face interactions minimal. At one stage, I had an ectopic pregnancy that ended painfully, and Jane used it as an opportunity to gloat or cause drama. She became enraged that we were trying to start a family, as if that threatened her position even further. I recall she said something to John like, "You're too old to be having more kids," or "You already have children. You can't replace them." It was insidious the way she'd twist any piece of news into an attack on us. When I eventually got pregnant again with our son Cole, we decided to let John's children know early, so they wouldn't hear it through rumors or from their mother's manipulative mouth. Jane went berserk. She told them that John wouldn't love them anymore once Cole was born, that he'd forget they even existed. By the time Cole arrived, through a terrifying delivery that nearly killed both me and him, we were dealing with Jane's constant attempts to turn John's kids against us. Meanwhile, I was recovering from a major surgery, cesarean, and a near-death experience. My emotions were all over the place. We wanted to see his children and keep them involved in Cole's life, but each visit was fraught with tension. They were half expecting John to suddenly unleash some fury on them, because Jane kept telling them, "Watch out. Now that Cole's here, your dad's changed." In reality, John was as gentle as ever, and he just wanted them all to get along. Sometimes we'd host them at our tiny 2-bedroom house. The difference in living conditions was stark. Jane lived in a 5-bedroom, 3-story home with a triple driveway, plenty of space and an air of affluence. Meanwhile, we squeezed into our small quarters, but we made it work. The kids noticed, ironically, that we cooked real meals. Jane, being busy with her shop or her love life, mostly gave them microwave dinners or takeaways, so they'd visit us and devour home-cooked food with gusto. John's daughter especially loved my cooking, which warmed my heart, though she remained cautious around me, no doubt from hearing her mother's repeated warnings that I'd replace or overshadow her. Jane continued to push for more maintenance money. She'd call John, screaming about needing more funds, claiming she couldn't pay her bills. One time, John let her rant for a solid half hour, then calmly reminded her that he knew she'd pocketed over £40,000 from the house sale that she'd never admitted to. Legally, that money was half his, but he'd allowed her to keep it under the informal agreement that she'd use it for the kids' benefit, things like schooling, weddings, or other major life events. The moment he brought that up, she quieted down. She realized if she pushed too hard, He might take her to court over that hidden portion, so she backed off for a while. It was one of the few times John had real leverage, and it gave us a small respite from her incessant demands. Time marched on. I eventually developed cancer, which overshadowed the usual day-to-day conflicts. At that point, Cole was around 9, and John's daughter was getting married. We told her that we couldn't contribute huge sums to the wedding, because Jane had presumably been saving that $40,000 for such occasions. But Jane had burned through it all, propping up her failing shop. Sadly, that meant the wedding would be somewhat limited. But John's daughter understood once we explained what had happened. She saw how her mother's finances were always in chaos. On the day of the wedding, I wore a lovely size 10 dress. By then, I'd lost quite a bit of weight due to the cancer treatments and post-treatment complications. I paired it with heels and did my best to look poised. Jane, on the other hand, was used to being the center of attention, especially in terms of material status. She wore a fancy outfit, but the moment she saw me, younger and looking healthy, she seemed to deflate. I didn't rub it in her face. It was her daughter's wedding day after all, and I wasn't about to cause a scene, so I remained polite and civil. Jane tried to make some subtle digs. I heard them, but I ignored them. My main priority was to ensure that John's daughter had a lovely wedding and that everyone got along publicly. I'm sure Jane resented that I didn't engage in her drama, but it wasn't the time or place. In the subsequent years, Jane's finances deteriorated further. She had to sell the big house to bail out her shop again, mostly because the tax authorities came and cracked down on her. She ended up renting a small 2-bedroom flat, a big fall from the lifestyle she'd once maintained. Meanwhile, John and I continued living in our modest 2-bedroom house, prioritizing Cole's needs and trying to keep life stable. We never had illusions of grandeur. We just wanted security and harmony. His children, now grown, were fine, but they still bore emotional scars from all the manipulation in their younger years. The daughter, who'd moved into a lovely home with her husband, invited us for her own daughter's first birthday. That event turned out to be a pivotal moment for me. Leading up to that first birthday party, I faced another significant health scare. I lost a huge amount of weight in a short period, something like 4 stone in a month, and I feared the worst, that my cancer had returned. Thankfully, it turned out to be complications from the previous cancer site, not new cancer, but the rapid weight loss left me in an unusually slim state. I was typically short and chubby, but now I was edging toward a size 6'8". Physically, I looked quite different. Jane, on the other hand, had been drinking heavily throughout the pandemic. From what I heard, she'd gained a noticeable amount of weight, had a ruddy complexion, and generally seemed less put together than her old self, who used to strut around full of confidence in her stylish outfits. She was always tall and wore her clothes well, but the changes in her health and lifestyle were evident. I arrived at the party feeling a bit self-conscious. I didn't want to draw attention. My main goal was just to be there for the granddaughter's birthday. But when Jane saw me, she air-kissed me, the sort of greeting that's more habit than sincerity, and made a remark about how amazing I looked. In that split second, all the memories of her calling me that short, fat thing, all the time she gloated or tried to poison the kids against me, everything rushed through my mind. It was probably only a moment, but it felt like an eternity. I realized she was giving me a compliment through gritted teeth, as if it physically hurt her to say I looked good. I responded with, "You look healthy," giving her a brief up-and-down glance. That might seem trivial, but for a woman whose entire identity rested on appearances, someone who used to demean me for my weight, I watched her face register shock and a flash of embarrassment. It was as if she suddenly understood that the tables had turned. Once upon a time, she was the confident, taller, more glamorous one. I was a short, overweight outsider. Now, she was heavier, older, dealing with wrinkles and redness, while I, though still older than I'd been, had slimmed down to a size she never expected me to be. In that moment, something shifted. I finally felt a sliver of vindication. I'm not usually one for petty revenge, but after enduring her snide comments for nearly 3 decades, that tiny jab of, "You look healthy," was deeply satisfying. Maybe it's not the most mature response, but it was honest. It was minimal, and it was exactly enough to shake her. The backstory behind all this, the emotional damage, the manipulations, the financial fiascos, was immense. Jane essentially stunted her own children's stability with her constant meddling and negativity. For years, She'd chosen to funnel her money into a shop that never turned a real profit. She ended up with no property of her own, renting a small place in a not-so-nice area, and the shop likely on the brink of closure. She'd taken to drinking too much, perhaps to numb her frustration, and though part of me felt pity, I couldn't forget the pain she'd caused me and John for so many years. It wasn't just the name-calling. It was the systematic campaign to alienate his children from him, the self-centered demands for money, the utter lack of empathy for how her actions threatened our stability. After the birthday party, I realized that one offhand remark had changed a dynamic that had been entrenched for ages. From that day on, she behaved differently around me. Perhaps she recognized that her usual condescension no longer worked. We now maintain a superficial civility. John keeps his distance, partly because she can still be quite draining, but also because years of stress have taught him to preserve his own emotional well-being. We live in a small 2-bedroom house, content with our simpler life. Our son, Cole, is off at university, thriving. John's older children get on well with Cole, to the point where they see each other independently. Their relationships have stabilized, even if the scars remain. Sometimes I reflect on the fact that nearly 10 years of my life were spent coping with her incessant hostility. For a long while, I believed it was just the way things had to be. An ex-wife who never let go, never forgave, and never accepted that her marriage was over. She needed constant drama. If I could travel back in time and give myself a pep talk, I might say, don't bend over backwards to appease her. Set boundaries earlier. Stand firm. But we don't get such neat do-overs. We learn as we go, and I learned that small acts of quiet pushback can be incredibly liberating. Even so, I don't want to overstate that single healthy comment as if it solved everything. It was more like a punctuation mark on a long sentence of conflict. A moment that let her know I wasn't the insecure, overweight target she could bully anymore. That it was petty I won't deny, but after years of biting my tongue, absorbing her cruelty, hearing how she referred to me in humiliating ways, and watching her drain John's resources, it felt justified. Maybe I could have chosen a more graceful method of confrontation. But sometimes raw honesty is what ends up happening in the moment, and it worked in its own small, cathartic way. Through all the financial storms, the property disputes, the heartbreak of John's business failing, and my own battle with cancer, we somehow found a measure of contentment. I'm proud that John and I withstood those storms. We never had huge wealth or an opulent house, but we had genuine affection and mutual respect. We tried to raise Cole with compassion, encouraging him to know his half-siblings so they'd have a bond despite the age gap. Jane, for all her spite, never managed to break that bond between John and his older children. Over time, they realized her tales of how Dad doesn't love you anymore were manipulative, and as they matured into adults, they forged their own relationships with us, seeing who we truly were, rather than believing her versions of events. Today, Jane's life revolves around that ailing clothes shop, the same one that caused so much friction. She has little to no savings and rents a cramped flat. From what I hear, she's teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, though it's unclear if that's rumor or close to reality. Regardless, she's far removed from the days when she lorded over a big house, dictating John's finances. I find it impossible not to feel a twinge of sympathy, yet I recall how cunning and hurtful she was. And that sympathy only goes so far. It's like I hold two truths in my mind. She's a human being who's ended up in a tough spot, and she's also the same woman who put me through immense emotional agony for years. I guess it all boils down to perspective. There's a satisfaction in knowing that I survived her onslaught, that John and I built a stable life despite her best efforts to derail it. We have our small home, our son's bright future, and even John's older kids have grown into decent people who understand the truth of those years. Meanwhile, Jane's illusions of success have crumbled around her. In that sense, I never needed to wage some grand revenge scheme. Life took care of leveling the playing field in its own manner. My single act of retribution, if one can call it that, was simply telling her she looked healthy in that pointed tone, letting her see in my eyes that I hadn't forgotten the years of insults. I suppose in some ways it was a small gesture, but loaded with meaning. For someone else, it might not seem like much, but for me, it symbolized a release of pent-up frustration. It also signaled a shift in power. She realized she couldn't torment me about my size or looks anymore. If that moment changed the dynamic among 6 people, John, me, her, and the kids, then all the better. Maybe it allowed for a more balanced relationship going forward, even if it's an uneasy peace. I look back over the 27 years of dealing with her chaos. My marriage with John had to withstand long episodes of tension rooted in her manipulations. She withheld information about the kids, badmouthed us, demanded money, reaped the house proceeds in secret, refused to hold up her end of co-parenting responsibilities, and constantly ridiculed me. Yet we endured. We might never be close to her. John keeps interactions minimal, and I'm perfectly content with that. We have our life, and she has hers. Our son's grown. John's older children have families of their own, and if we cross paths at a family function, we can manage civility without letting her reignite any old drama. After nearly 3 decades, the epilogue is that I'm still here, living with John in our modest place, grateful that Cole is thriving, and content with my life's trajectory. We overcame so much. The near-fatal childbirth, my cancer battles, the financial pressure, the emotional minefields. The ex-wife, meanwhile, continues to chase her illusions of success, propping up that shop, clinging to an identity that's slipping away. I can't fully blame her for her insecurities, but I also won't excuse her cruelty. At the end of the day, she's the one who created so much of the bitterness that consumed her. If someone were to ask me whether that single snarky comment, saying, "You look healthy," really changed things, I'd say maybe it wasn't the sole cause, but it encapsulated a shift. It reminded her that I wasn't the same person she used to belittle. I stood my ground, showing her that I had self-respect. And strangely enough, that tiny moment of defiance was cathartic for me. It felt like tying a bow on years of silent endurance. Life went on. Jane eventually accepted the reality of the bigger picture. That John and I were a permanent unit. That her children were no longer under her complete control. She quietly retreated into her own realm of financial woes. We now operate in parallel universes that only overlap when family gatherings demand it. We're cordial, maybe even somewhat friendly on the surface, but there's no deep trust or warmth. The best part is that John's older kids have a bond with Cole, and everyone can gather together without open warfare. That's progress. I sometimes think about how such conflicts happen in so many blended families. You read stories of stepchildren resenting a new spouse, ex-wives, or ex-husbands, interfering for years. Everyone entangled in bitterness. There's rarely a neat, happy ending for those who want to unify families. But in our case, the kids eventually saw the truth, and we reached a workable peace. We'll never regain the years lost to feuding, but at least we came out the other side mostly intact. I also reflect on how Jane's materialism never brought her real happiness. She was always chasing something. Bigger houses, new shops, fresh business ideas, ways to one-up me in appearance or possessions. Yet she ended up with none of it, living a smaller life than she ever imagined. I'm not gloating. It's just an observation. Sometimes a single-minded pursuit of stuff leaves you empty-handed and lonely. Meanwhile, we have a simple home, stable relationships, and although I've fought illness, I can say I'm surrounded by genuine love. So that's the gist of my 27-year odyssey with the bitter ex-wife. She tried to make my life miserable, from petty nicknames to major financial sabotages. She withheld the children from John, lied to them, launched rumors, and even used my ectopic pregnancy as a twisted reason to rant at me. For a long time, I let it roll off my back, focusing on protecting my own mental and physical health. Then, at a family event, I happened to look good enough to shock her. In one petty moment, I reciprocated her old snark with that loaded comment about her looking healthy. Yes, it was childishly satisfying, but if you consider all the humiliation and stress she subjected me to, it was a mere drop in the bucket. Since then, John and I continue to build a quiet, loving life. Our son Cole is at university, thriving in his independence, maintaining a decent rapport with his half-siblings. John's older son and daughter have carved out stable lives, forging careers and families of their own. The tension between them and Jane has eased, though they, too, see the patterns that defined her approach to life. Ultimately, no matter how many curveballs she threw, time and perseverance saw us through. And in that one fleeting second at a birthday party, I found a tiny revenge that changed the dynamic for good. It may not seem like the grandest retribution in the world, but it was enough to remind her, and remind me that I wasn't the same easy target I'd been before. Maybe that's all I needed.